Well, good morning. I hope this message finds you doing well. There is so much going on right now with the coronavirus, uncertainty, anxiety, fear. There's sickness, cancellations, etc. And then obviously it's had an impact here as we've had to cancel services until April 5th. And we appreciate your patience, your understanding, and I want to encourage you to take the necessary precautions to stay as healthy as you possibly can, and encourage each of us to be in prayer about this situation. Prayer for our healthcare workers, prayer for those who are ill, pray for those who are making decisions going forward. And we're glad that we can at least share the message with you each week during this time, and we really, truly thank you for tuning in. And in light of this very serious situation, I ask that we reflect on it while listening to this message. I had a framework of messages mapped out through Mark's gospel, and we're staying with that. And what's interesting is that the message today and the scripture passage are very applicable right now, I believe, and for our situation that we find ourselves in. So hopefully you'll find it very timely and with where we are in our nation and in our world today. So last week, we looked at a passage out of Mark chapter 8 and how Mark 8, if you were here and you remember, if not, let me just restate that Mark 8 is really like the turning point in Mark's gospel. And his gospel account, we talked about Jesus healing this blind man, a man who Jesus touched twice because he didn't see clearly after the first touch. And we talked about the disciples' eyes being open to who Jesus was as Peter, speaking for the rest of the disciples, confessed him as the Messiah. And that was the turning point for sure, but there's more to it. I touched on that last week, that we would be looking at it today. It's a turning point, but the path going forward wasn't as the disciples had anticipated. I mean, it's great, right, that they recognized and claimed Jesus as Messiah, but what followed that and what Jesus said is unheard of in their minds. So let's look at it. And reminder, this is right after the man is healed and Peter confesses Christ as Messiah. We're going to be in Mark 8, starting in verse 31. It says, "He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. 'Get behind me, Satan,' he said. 'You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns.'" It says he began to teach them. And so there's something new here. There's something evidently that Jesus couldn't teach until they really saw him as the Messiah. And this something new was that Jesus, the Son of Man, must suffer and die and rise again. So what? When you read that, and if you put yourself in their position, what? I mean, and Peter rebukes him for that. And now we have a tendency to kind of hack on Peter some here, and the fact that he rebuked Jesus and questioned what Jesus had just said. But I think we need to understand something about this before we can really be too hard on him. There was a Messiah coming for Israel and for the Jews, and they just claimed him as such. But really, what kind of Messiah dies? What kind of Messiah proclaims his own death? And where he says, and killed by the authorities? That's a question in our minds, because, the Messiah is supposed to be the authority. The Messiah is supposed to be the one to put the other authorities in their place, not be killed by him. This kind of Messiah could really only be seen in some people's mind as a false one, a fake. But this is the way it is to be. It is this way that it would go, is what Jesus was saying. It's this way. And even Peter, his right-hand man, doesn't get it. And even as he has the audacity to call Jesus out. And it says he rebuked him, but then Jesus responds and says, "Get behind me, Satan." What kind of a statement is that to one of your closest followers? In Matthew's account of this part of the story, after Peter, who was referred to as Simon, in Matthew's account, after he claims Jesus as Messiah, Jesus tells him that from now on, he's going to be called Peter, which in Greek means rock. But now Jesus refers to him as Satan. Now that's a switch, isn't it? You go from being called the rock to being called Satan. And I think we need to really pay attention to what Jesus says to him after that rebuke. And he says this, he says, "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." In other words, anything that opposes, anything that stands against the plans or the concerns of God is evil. It's from Satan, the accuser. And I think that's a challenge maybe for us even. A question I guess we should ask ourselves. Are our thoughts on the things of God? Do we look at things from God's perspective or God's point of view? But then let's take it to another level. Do we live our lives from God's perspective? Do we act and live and love according to how God desires, even in a world that largely would see it as crazy or madness? I think about the situation we find ourselves in right now with the coronavirus. It's like the world is kind of going crazy. Yeah, I'm not saying we shouldn't be concerned. This is a very serious health risk and health situation. And I'm not saying we shouldn't seek to acquire things to take care of ourselves, right? I mean, we should do that. We need bread. We need food. We need milk. And yes, we need toilet paper. And evidently, we need lots of it because it's hard to find it anywhere. But we need those things, so there's nothing wrong in doing that. But it is like for some, the focus is totally on self-preservation. Again, not saying we shouldn't take care of ourselves. Of course we should. But in the midst of that, what about others who can't get what they need? What about those who can't get out, or even if they can, they shouldn't, with all things considered? Rodna was sharing a story with me this morning that she saw on Facebook. It actually went viral. There was a lady who shared a story. She was going in a store to get some groceries and things, and when she was walking through the parking lot, she heard a voice. And she got paying attention, and she looked, and there was an elderly couple in a car. So she went over to the car and just to make sure they were okay, and the lady rolled down her window like that far. And she says, "There's some things we need from the store, but we are scared to death to go in because we're elderly and we don't want to contract something, put ourselves at risk." She said, "We're just looking for somebody that could go get our stuff for us." And the lady says, "Well, I'll do it. I can do that." So the elderly lady slips a $100 bill through the crack in the window. The lady goes in, gets her stuff, gets their stuff for them, brings it out, puts it in her car, gives her her change back, and off they go. That's what I'm talking about when a perspective of God and God's view of things, especially in the situation we find ourselves in the midst of chaos and craziness, do we respond with acts of love and generosity? Do we respond with acts of love and generosity, which in some people's minds might seem crazy? Here's the point, that knowing and living the concerns of God is the path of life. Knowing and living the concerns of God is the path of life. It's this way, is what Jesus is saying. This is what is most important. And speaking of self-preservation, the rest of our passage really, if self-preservation is our sole focus, the rest of this passage flies right in its face. Because Peter and others think it's madness that the Messiah must die. But even that is about to go to a whole nother level. So let's look at Mark 8, starting in verse 34 now. It says, "Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, 'Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels.'" Now, We see crosses all the time, don't we? I mean, you don't have to look very far to see a cross. We wear crosses as jewelry. You know, some people get tattoos that are crosses, and you know, you watch ball games now. Well, you can't do that for a while because most of them are canceled. But if you watch like NFL players and different things like that, a lot of times they even use the eye black to take away the reflection of the light, and they put that on in the shape of a cross. But hopefully these are all really reminders of what Christ accomplished on the cross. But at the time Jesus said this, there wasn't any other interpretation of the cross. It wasn't a religious icon. When he told them that to follow him meant to take up your cross, they knew exactly what he meant, what he was saying. Because in that day and time, the cross meant nothing other than crucifixion. It only meant capital punishment handed down by the powers of Rome on those who opposed them and their agendas. And at the time that Mark wrote this account, crosses were quite visible for those reading or hearing this story, because it was at that time, right when there was a Jewish insurrection taking place. There was a Jewish uprising against the authorities, against the government. It was underway. It was going on. So guess where those who opposed Rome found themselves if they were caught or captured? That's right. They found themselves on a cross. And these nationalists see these people involved in this attempt to overthrow the powers and the government. They were recruiting other people to come join them and take up the sword against Rome. But Mark's Jesus, our Jesus, the one Mark's writing about here, he is recruiting people to take up their cross. This way of following Jesus means self-denial. To follow Jesus means self-denial. And self-denial is costly. But self-denial is the Jesus way of life. It's life as God intends. This is the kingdom way. This is where on earth as it is in heaven is made possible by them and by us as we help bring about peace, love, forgiveness. Because we remove ourselves, we remove our agendas out of the center and make the kingdom agenda central. In our passage, Jesus restates this another way, where he says, "For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it." Let me read that again. "For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it." So if one wants to save their life by denying and rejecting Jesus and his mission, one will really actually lose life. Do you see where this would have been a challenge for the disciples and the hearers in that day and time? I mean, to bow to the Roman way in order to save their life, their way of life meant to reject Jesus' way, and to this means to miss out on true life. And this can be really, if we think about it, and if we're honest, this can be challenging for us as well. But as we've been talking about, as we've been going through Mark and this path of discipleship theme that we find in Mark, we too have a choice. And to choose the path of Jesus is to choose the path of real, true life. It's this way, Jesus says, that we find life as God intends. And as we live life as God intends, guess what? Others get to experience it as well. One last point related to this self-denial that Jesus is teaching is actually a question by Jesus. And it's actually an economic metaphor, if you will, where he says this: "What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul?" If we look at this from an economic perspective, like profits and gains and losses and forfeiture, then what he's saying is that to seek and to hang on to self-preservation at the cost of rejecting faith in Christ and following him, well, this is a bad investment. It's a bad investment. Our culture, if you look around, you pay attention, is one where of calculating success based on wins and losses, on gain and losses, on how much we acquire versus how much we give away. That's our cultural message and ideology. This way, Jesus says, my way means to measure success differently. It means not investing in what we can gain ourselves, not to follow the way of culture and invest only in what we can get. Rather, it means investing in wholeness of life for all. Investing in justice where there are systems that oppress. Investing in nonviolent resolutions. Investing in healing when ourselves or others are hurting. And just as Jesus announced that He was walking directly into danger, so too it may be for us if we follow this way of Christ. It can be dangerous to follow because we too might be rejected. We too might encounter opposition because those around us may see our desire to follow Christ, to love unconditionally, to stand in the gap for those who are hurting. Others might see that as madness or crazy or unthinkable in their minds. But again, it all goes back to having our eyes open to see as God sees. It means to have our minds open and focused on the mind and the teachings of Jesus, to clearly focus on God's view and God's perspective. There's a really good book I've been reading and using some as a resource through these sermons through Mark's Gospel, and it's a book titled Say to This Mountain. And it's written by one of the authors is Ched Myers. And he states this, I want to share this quote. He says, quote, "The gospel invitation to deny self then does not refer to the negation of experience, selfhood, human rights, or physical integrity. Rather, it challenges the self as the center of one's universe. It calls us out of life centered in individualism and self-interest and into life according to God's love." End quote. I couldn't have said that any better. It's this way that Jesus says to follow. It's this way of living according to God's love that we really find life. And in so doing, others experience life as well. You know, I think about our situation we find ourselves in. Opportunities for us to hear and feel Jesus say, it's this way. It's this way when we reach out to someone and go to the store for them who can't. It's this way, the Jesus way, when we take meals to those who can't get out. It's this way when we help meet the needs of those whose jobs are affected, you know, by this possibly maybe not even getting paid. It's the Jesus way when we reach out and help them. I'm not saying that God made this coronavirus happen to wake us up as a nation and world, though some may have that view. I'm not saying that God is punishing us. That's not how I personally see God. But my perspective is this, that I want to share with you. Maybe it's times like this that move us. Maybe it's times like this that lead us to opening our eyes more to the world around us and how we can engage it. In times of uncertainty, chaos, where things aren't quote unquote normal, rather than focusing on what's not good, maybe God is saying, look at this as an opportunity. Look at this as an opportunity to deny self and to bring love, care, compassion, help to those who are in need. An opportunity to bring peace, hope, encouragement in the midst of fear and anxiety. An opportunity to reject taking part in pointing fingers or casting blame or questioning and criticizing others, particularly those who are making decisions, sometimes very difficult decisions, but rather be a voice of reason and encouragement. I think that's the Jesus way. So let's go, South Parkersburg Baptist Church. Let's be a people who continue to have our eyes open, a people who take ourselves out of the center, a people who say it's this way to real life. Follow me and my ways, Jesus said. May we do that every day going forward. Now, I don't know if you're watching this with family, or maybe a few of you got together to watch it together. I don't know how you're doing this, but I want to pose some questions, maybe challenges going forward. And if you're with your family or you're with others, maybe discuss it together. I think it would be a healthy thing to do. So first thing's this. Ask yourself, who do you know that might need assistance this week? Who do you know that maybe can't get out, shouldn't get out, or hadn't been able to work? Who are those people around you? Second question, how can you help convey peace and unity? For example, social media is getting blasted with accusations, criticisms, etc. So should we as followers of Christ not be using that as an avenue of peace and unity? So how can we better do that? Question 3, how can you extend grace and compassion? Who out there maybe feels alone, or they're doing everything they can to keep it together? Who can we extend grace and compassion to? And then lastly, what do you have resource-wise that others could benefit from? Remember, this self-denial means having this perspective and this way of life to where we ourselves are not the center of the universe. We're an important part of it, but we're not the center. So what resources do we have that we could share with others who might have a need and could benefit from? I pray that you all have a blessed week. Continue praying for us as a church, for our community, and for our world. And may the peace of God that transcends all understanding guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Be blessed.